Guaranteed your money back if she doesn't satisfy you, the dealer barked, and the room broke into laughter. The cowboy didn't flinch. He just stared quiet and steady. The livestock barn behind the gambling hall had never been built for people. Yet under its splintered rafters, men gathered when they wanted something too shameful to ask for in daylight. The walls reeked of horse's manure and spilled whiskey. Lanterns swung from rusted hooks, throwing a weak yellow glow over faces that hid too many sins. The air was thick with sweat and cruelty. June Avery McCall stood barefoot on the packed dirt, her wrists bound in front of her. The rope had chewed her skin, raw, angry red welts cut deep into her flesh. Her buckskin dress, once decent, was ripped open at the neckline and torn along her sides. One seam had split near her chest, revealing the curve of a bruise that spread over one rib. Another dark mark showed on her thigh, where a boot had struck when she fought back. She kept her head low, not from submission, but because looking up only fed the hunger in the men's eyes. They weren't there to help her. Some leaned forward chewing tobacco like they were judging cattle. One snickered whenever someone pointed at her torn bodice. Another nudged his friend, whispering something foul that made them both grin. June's chest burned with every breath. Her throat was dry. She hadn't had water since sunrise. Sweat trickled down her back and dried in streaks of salt. She knew what could happen here. It had happened before. She focused on one thing: don't show fear. If she cried, they'd enjoy it. If she begged, they'd talk about it for weeks. The man running the auction was Buck Slater, a slick dealer who'd been trading flesh and cards up and down the frontier for years. His vest was too bright for a place that stank of horses, and his hair was greased back until it shined under the lanterns. A thick gold ring flashed each time he waved his hand. He'd won June from a gambler in Austin Junction, some drunk fool who'd bet too high and lost everything, including her. Buck didn't care what happened next. As long as someone paid, the night would end with coin in his pocket. "Guaranteed your money back if she don't please you," he shouted, arms spread wide. The men hollered with laughter. Someone yelled to inspect the goods. Another pretended to start the bidding just for sport. The barn grew hotter, smaller, more dangerous. And in the far corner, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, a man stood apart. Wyatt Reed. He was 38, tall, and built lean from ranch work and years hauling lumber through hard winters. His coat was worn thin, his boots scarred from endless miles of trail. A faded scar split his left brow, an old fight long forgotten. His dark hair was tied back loosely, and his jaw carried the rough shadow of days without shaving. He hadn't come to buy anyone. He rarely came to Redstone Hollow at all. He lived alone out in the scrub hills, half a day's ride from town. 6 years ago, a border raid had taken his 2 younger brothers, Cole and Jesse Reed, and he hadn't been the same since. He'd only come into town to pick up a crate of tools he'd ordered. But when he passed the gambling hall and heard the noise from the barn, something in the sound made him stop. He told himself he'd just take a look, then leave. But when he saw June standing there, beaten, trembling, and still somehow unbroken, he didn't move on. He didn't look at her the way the others did. His eyes caught the rope around her wrists, the bruises on her ribs, the way she refused to bow her head. That kind of stillness he'd seen before in men cornered under a gun barrel and in horses that had been whipped too long. A cold anger stirred in him, slow and deep. When Buck Slater repeated his pitch, "Guaranteed, or you get your coin back," the laughter that followed made Wyatt's stomach turn. No one expected a quiet stranger to step forward, but he did. "I'll pay," he said. The laughter died. Heads turned. Buck blinked, confused. What I said I'll pay. Name your price. The dealer smirked, tossing out a number so high it drew whistles from the crowd. He expected the stranger to back down. But Wyatt didn't argue, didn't blink. He reached inside his worn coat, pulled out a leather pouch, and spilled coins across the crate one by one. The barn fell silent, except for the sound of metal hitting wood. Wyatt's heartbeat stayed calm, his face unreadable beneath the flickering lamplight. He didn't look at June Avery McCall, though he could feel her stillness behind him, the weight of her fear hanging in the air. Buck Slater counted the coins, his usual swagger gone, and muttered under his breath, "She's yours then." Wyatt didn't answer. He stepped to the post, pulled the knife from his belt, and with a single clean stroke, sliced through the rope, binding her wrists. The rope fell to the dirt, and June's arms trembled with the sudden freedom. She didn't know what came next, if she'd be dragged to another room, thrown in a wagon, or handed off again. She didn't know if this man was better or worse than the rest. But even from the corner of her eye, she could tell he wasn't smiling. Wyatt didn't touch her. He nudged the fallen rope aside with his boot, gave one glance toward the open door, and started walking. For a second, June just stood there, too stunned to move. Then she followed him not out of trust, but because staying meant being dragged again. Outside, the night air cut sharp and cold, carrying the smell of dust instead of sweat. The yellow glow of the saloon spilled faintly across the alley as they passed. Wyatt led her to a wagon hitched to a bay horse. The bed was filled with tools rope and a folded blanket. He stopped beside the rear wheel and looked at her for the first time. "Get in," he said quietly. June hesitated, searching his face for any sign of what he wanted. His expression didn't shift. No threat, no mockery, just the steady calm of a man who'd seen too much. She climbed into the back and sat her hands folded in her lap. The skin around her wrists burned with every small movement. Wyatt climbed to the front seat, took the reins, and without another word, guided the horse forward. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled onto the main road. June kept her gaze down but couldn't help glancing back. The barn where she'd stood, bound and humiliated, was shrinking behind them, swallowed by darkness. She didn't know where he was taking her, or if he was any different from the men inside. But at least he hadn't laughed. And for now, that was the only comfort she had. The wagon rattled down the hard-packed road, each bump sending pain through her ribs. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves, the clinking harness, and the whisper of dry wind. June sat curled in the back, rubbing the tender grooves on her wrists. Questions crowded her mind, but she bit them back. Asking had cost her too much before. Why did he buy me? What does he want when we stop? Wyatt kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He wasn't thinking about what those men in the barn believed. His thoughts were on the miles of road between him and his land. He'd left Redstone Hollow that morning with nothing but a crate of tools and a sack of flour, planning to be home before dark. He hadn't expected to bring anyone back, least of all, a woman who looked like she'd walked through hell. But he couldn't stand there and watch it happen. He'd done that once before on the night raiders came while he was gone, and his brothers Cole and Jesse Reed never lived to see morning. He'd lived with that guilt ever since. After nearly an hour, the road narrowed into rough brush and tall grass. The moonlight painted pale ruts ahead. Neither spoke. Wyatt could hear her shifting now and then, trying to ease the pain in her legs. He didn't turn around. He knew if he did, he'd see the rope burns, the torn dress, the bruises, and anger wouldn't help either of them. Eventually, her voice broke the quiet. "How far?" "4 more miles," he said, without looking back. She fell silent again, but some of the stiffness left her shoulders. 4 miles meant she wasn't being dropped off in town. Men who bought women usually didn't ride this far unless they planned to use them and bury what was left. But he hadn't laid a hand on her. That thought was the only fragile piece of hope she held. As the wagon climbed into the low hills dotted with scrub cedar, the air grew colder. June's bare feet were numb from the wind. She reached for the blanket in the wagon bed and pulled it over her legs. The fabric smelled of smoke and sun-dried grass. He didn't say a word or glance back. Somehow that silence unsettled her more than a shout would have. After a long while, she asked, "You got a wife out there?" "No." His answer was flat, final. She nodded to herself, letting the quiet settle. He didn't ask her name, and maybe he didn't care to know it. Men like him rarely did. Another mile passed before he spoke again, his tone calm and measured like the rhythm of the road ahead. "You'll need water when we get there," Wyatt Reed said quietly. June Avery McCall hesitated, unsure if it was a trick or a test. "Yes," she finally murmured. He gave a small nod and said nothing more. By the time the cabin came into sight, the moon had climbed higher, washing the land in silver light. The ground dropped into shallow gullies and dry creek beds, the kind that whispered with ghosts when the wind passed through. The cabin wasn't much, just a single-room shack made of rough pine, the cracks sealed with dried mud. A small lean-to stable leaned against one side, and neat stacks of cut cedar waited by the door. No lantern glowed inside, no smoke rose from the chimney. It was the kind of place a man built for solitude, not company. Wyatt stopped the wagon beside a water trough, climbed down, and began unhitching the bay horse. His hands moved slow but steady, the weariness in his shoulders betraying the long ride. When he finally looked back at the wagon, June was still sitting there, clutching the blanket close to her chest. He didn't offer a hand. "You can walk," he said in that same low tone. June climbed down careful with her bruised leg. The dirt was cold against her bare feet, biting into cracked skin. She didn't flinch, but he noticed anyway. He pushed the door open and stepped inside first. A soft click echoed as he lit a lantern, filling the space with a faint amber glow. The cabin was sparse. One narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, a single shelf with a few tin plates, a wood stove tucked near the wall, and a trunk sitting at the foot of the bed. A pair of scuffed boots lay by the door, and an old rifle leaned against the far corner. There wasn't a trace of a woman, no extra cup, no folded shawl, no second blanket. It was a home for one man and no one else. Wyatt poured water from a barrel into a tin cup and set it on the table. "Drink," he said simply. June stepped in, slowly feeling warmth from the faint embers still alive in the stove. She hadn't been indoors without shouting men in months. She took the cup, drank carefully, and watched him over the rim. He didn't stare at her torn dress or bare skin. He didn't ask what she'd done or what she'd give in return. He didn't even look disgusted. Just tired. She lowered the cup and asked softly, "Why did you take me?" Wyatt met her gaze only for a moment. "Didn't want to leave you there." It wasn't a grand answer, but it was the first one she'd heard in years that didn't come with a price. She didn't thank him. Gratitude still felt dangerous. He pointed toward the bed. "You take that tonight." Then he pulled a folded wool blanket from the trunk and tossed it beside the stove. "I'll sleep here." June blinked in surprise. Men didn't give up beds they claimed them. "You're not asking for anything," she said cautiously. "No." He knelt by the stove and began stacking kindling. The sound of dry wood popping filled the room, startling her with its simple, homely rhythm. June glanced at the bed, then at him, then at the door. She didn't understand him, but she was too sore and cold to argue with kindness she didn't trust. She stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do with her hands, her body, her breath. Every man before had used silence as a threat, a way to bend her to his will. Wyatt's silence was different, but she didn't know that yet. He laid out his blanket on the floor, crouching by the stove, as the fire began to catch. The glow brushed across his face, cutting sharp lines of exhaustion and restraint. June watched, uncertain fear still curled in her chest like a coiled snake. What if this was a trick? What if he changed his mind once she fell asleep? But another thought crept in, quiet and unfamiliar. Maybe she wasn't in danger tonight. Wyatt stood and brushed his hands together. "There's a basin on the shelf if you want to wash. Water's from the barrel kept inside for winter." He didn't say it like an order, or even a suggestion, just a fact. She didn't move. Her mind spun with questions she didn't dare voice. Where was the nearest town? Did he live out here alone because he'd lost someone? Would anyone from Redstone Hollow come looking for her? She broke the silence with a question barely above a whisper. "You live out here alone all this time?" Wyatt closed the stove door with a dull metallic thud. 5 years. 5 years. The words came out heavier than Wyatt Reed meant them to. June Avery McCall absorbed the silence that followed. 5 years, no wife, no voice beside his, no other hands mending fences or lighting fires. Just the quiet ache of a man left alone too long. Maybe he wanted someone now. Maybe that's why he hadn't left her back in Redstone Hollow. Or maybe he just couldn't stomach walking away while men treated a woman like an animal. He finally turned toward her. "You need food before you sleep." June hesitated. Eating in front of men had always come with a price. There's something she murmured carefully. Wyatt only nodded and walked to a wooden cupboard. He brought out a tin bowl, placed a chunk of coarse bread and a strip of dried venison inside, then poured her a cup of warm water from a kettle resting on the stove. He set it on the table, not handing it to her directly. June stepped closer, but kept a few feet between them. She waited to see if he'd sit across from her to watch her like others had. He didn't. He turned instead to unlace his boots by the door. The silence felt strange, not threatening, but still edged with tension. June ate slowly. The bread was rough but fresh enough, and the meat hurt her jaw where she'd been struck before. Still, she chewed without complaint. When she finished, she glanced around, unsure what to do with the bowl. Wyatt looked up briefly. "Leave it. I'll take care of it in the morning." That answer didn't make sense to her. No one had ever told her to leave work undone. She studied him, broad shoulders under a worn shirt, hands thick with calluses, and eyes marked by sun and loss. He wasn't soft, but nothing in him spoke of cruelty. He rolled out his blanket on the floor near the stove, not by the door where most men would lie to keep a woman from running. That small detail unsettled her even more than anger would have. Finally, the question that had been gnawing at her since the wagon slipped out. "You expect something later?" He met her eyes calmly. "No." She waited for another word, for a twist that would change the meaning, but none came. People didn't do things for nothing. No one had ever spent coin on her freedom. If he didn't want her body, what did he want? Why risk his money, his name for someone like her? Her voice hardened. "Then why take me?" Wyatt leaned back on his elbows on the floor, staring at the ceiling instead of her. "I didn't plan to," he said simply. "But I'm not the kind of man who watches a woman get passed around in a barn like cattle and does nothing." There was no pride in his tone, just the flat honesty of a man stating a fact. June said nothing. The truth felt too heavy to touch. She thought about giving her name, but it stuck in her throat. He hadn't earned it yet. After a long pause, Wyatt stood again. "If you need anything, say it. If you can't sleep, don't worry, no one's coming through that door tonight." He blew out the lantern, the cabin falling into a soft, amber glow from the stove's fire. He lay down on the floor, arm tucked beneath his head, and exhaled slow. June stayed standing, watching him breathe. She studied his hands, his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed. She'd learned long ago that some men pretended to sleep before striking. Only when she was certain he wouldn't move did she sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin but softer than dirt. She laid back carefully, pulling the blanket to her chin. She kept her torn dress on, and her eyes open until exhaustion dragged them closed. Wyatt listened to the soft creak of the bed and the unsteady rhythm of her breath. He didn't move. The warmth of the stove crept across the room, steady and calm. He didn't know what morning would bring, if she'd run fight, or if someone from town might come looking. But one thing he knew for certain, he wouldn't take her back. June woke twice during the night, her heart pounding from old ghosts. Both times she listened. No footsteps, no shifting floorboards, only the faint crackle of fire and the slow, even sound of a man sleeping nearby. Each time, she lay back down. By dawn, without saying a word, both knew the same truth. Whatever came next, it wouldn't look anything like the life they'd left behind. The new day came quietly, without warning, like mercy. The kind of dawn that sneaks into a room before the sun crests the ridge, drifted across the cabin. June Avery McCall opened her eyes before the light reached the window. For a few fleeting seconds, she didn't remember where she was. Her muscles tensed out of old habit, waiting for the scrape of boots, a hand on her shoulder, a voice that meant danger. But none came. The cabin was still. The air smelled of pine smoke and cold ashes, not whiskey and sweat. The bed beneath her didn't sag from another body's weight. She lifted her head slightly. Wyatt Reed was still asleep on the floor by the stove, one arm resting across his chest, boots off, breathing slow and even. He looked like the kind of man who could sleep through thunder, but wake the moment a latch shifted. His rifle leaned in the corner, but his hand wasn't anywhere near it. That detail unsettled her more than if it had been. Men who'd lived with danger kept weapons close when a stranger shared their roof. Her wrists ached. She rubbed a thumb across one of the rope marks and winced at the sting. He'd cut the bindings, but the memory of every twist and pull was still there. The thought came uninvited. If he meant to use her, he would have done it while she slept. June's eyes drifted toward the door. It wasn't barred, just a wooden latch that could be lifted easily from inside. Outside, the wind moved through the grass and a board near the stable creaked in rhythm with it. No voices. No footsteps. No one else. Wyatt stirred soon after waking the way men who've lived too long alone often do, quiet, deliberate, half-aware, before their eyes even open. When he looked at her, there was no surprise, no lingering stare. He pushed himself up with a low grunt and reached for his boots. "You can wash up at the basin," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Cloth's on the shelf." June waited, half expecting a demand to follow. None came. She stood slowly, the blanket slipping from her legs, and crossed the room. The floor was cold but clean beneath her bare feet, cleaner than any place she'd slept in months. She dipped the cloth in the basin and wiped her face, neck, and arms. She stopped short of lifting her dress hem. She wasn't ready to turn her back to him, not yet. Wyatt stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, then stepped outside to check on the horse. The sky was pale and colorless, the sun still hiding behind the hills. His breath fogged in the cold air as he ran a hand down the horse's neck and checked the hooves by habit. Another day, Another chore. Wood to split fences to mend, and now someone to protect he hadn't planned on. When he came back in June, stood near the table, her arms folded loosely, watching him the way a wild thing watches the man who freed it, curious but wary. "There's bread from last night," Wyatt said, nodding toward the cupboard and dried apples. "I'll make coffee once the stove's hot." She almost asked why he was speaking to her like she had a choice. Instead, she said softly, "You got chores." He nodded once. "Always do. Out here they don't wait." He listed things without pride. 40 acres of rough land, a small herd of cattle, 2 miles north fences that needed mending, troughs that needed scrubbing. He wasn't boasting, just stating the life he lived. "You expect me to work for staying?" she asked finally. He paused. "If you want to, you can. If not, you walk when you're ready." That answer twisted something inside her. Walk where? Back to Redstone Hollow, where men would trade her again for the price of a drink. She looked at him sharply. "Men from town, will they come looking?" Wyatt shook his head. "No one cares enough to chase. Buck Slater got his money. The rest forgot you the second I drove off." The truth settled cold in her chest. He was probably right. No one had ever thought of her as something worth remembering. Still, fear didn't vanish that easily. Men didn't need reason to come. Wyatt poured coffee grounds into a dented tin pot and set it on the stove. His movements were calm, practiced the rhythm of a man long used to silence. There was no tremor in his hands, no guilt in his eyes, nothing she could read as danger. When he finally looked her way, it wasn't at her body or the torn edges of her dress. His gaze landed on her wrists. "I've got some salve in the trunk," he said quietly. "You want it for the rope burns?" Wyatt Reed asked. June Avery. McCall hesitated, unsure if accepting meant owing him something. After a breath, she nodded. Later, he said quietly, not pushing. He poured water into a blackened cookpot and set it on the stove. June folded her arms, watching every small movement, waiting for his mood to turn the way men's moods always did. A question built in her chest, one she knew anyone watching from outside would ask, why her? Why take a woman he didn't know? She finally said it out loud. "You ever done something like that before? Buying someone just to walk 'em out?" Wyatt paused, mid-motion. "No. Then why start with me?" He looked at her for a long, unflinching moment. "Because once, I walked away when I shouldn't have. I'm not doing that again." June could tell there was more behind those words, something heavier buried deep, but he didn't offer it, and she didn't press. It was the first truth he'd given her, and that was enough for now. She sat down at the table at last. The ache in her ribs had eased, replaced by a dull pulse instead of sharp pain. Wyatt poured himself coffee and set a second cup near her without comment. The steam rose between them, smelling bitter and strong. She didn't thank him, but she didn't refuse it either. That quiet exchange was the closest either of them could manage to a beginning. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the kind that hurt. Not like the barn. This one felt open, breathing space between two people who didn't quite trust silence yet. June tore the bread into small pieces, chewing carefully so her bruised jaw wouldn't flare with pain. Wyatt sipped his coffee. Eyes fixed on the stove, not on her. The quiet let her think, and thinking only stirred up more unease. How long did he plan to let her stay? Were there others before her? What did a man like him gain from taking her in? When his cup was empty, Wyatt stood and pulled on his coat. "I'll check the fence line. Be back before noon." He didn't tell her to stay put, didn't warn her about what not to touch. At the door he paused and added, "There's food in the cupboard if you're hungry. Barrel's half full. Firewood by the stove should last the day." He opened the door, hesitated a heartbeat, then said, "No one out here but me. If anyone rides up, don't open the door." Then he stepped outside. June sat still long after the door shut behind him. She waited for hoofbeats, expecting him to leave fast and not come back. Instead, she heard the steady rhythm of boots on hard dirt, the creak of leather, the dull clank of a stable post. She moved to the window and looked out. Wyatt was saddling his horse with slow, practiced motions. When he mounted, he didn't glance back toward the cabin. The moment he disappeared behind the ridge, her body reacted on instinct. Her mind snapped into survival. She scanned the room for exits, weapons, places to hide. The rifle in the corner was too heavy, too long for her to shoot straight, but she memorized where it stood. The knife he'd used to cut her ropes was gone. The trunk by the bed was closed tight. If he meant to trap her, he wouldn't leave her alone. She crossed to the basin again, dipping the cloth in water and wiping her face and neck, then gently over the bruises on her ribs. She pulled at the torn seam near her chest, trying to cover the exposed skin, but the fabric wouldn't hold. Her eyes searched the cabin for anything she could wear. On a peg near the door hung a wool shirt, old but clean. She hesitated, then took it down and pulled it over her head. It hung loose past her hips, sleeves too long, so she rolled them up. For the first time in months, her skin wasn't showing like an invitation. June's gaze drifted across the small space again. One bed, one chair, a stove and shelf with tin plates, a single mug, a hatchet by the woodpile. No hint another woman had ever lived here, no perfume, no folded dresses, no softness at all. She checked the latch on the door. It was solid wood, no outside bar. The windows were too small to squeeze through. Then her thoughts turned to the coins he'd paid. Men didn't forget what they'd spent. If he decided she wasn't worth it, he could take her back, or worse. She forced herself not to pace. On the trunk, she found a small tin. Inside was a pale salve that smelled of pine and lard. She touched it gingerly, then dabbed it across the rope burns on her wrists. It stung at first, then cooled. Maybe he'd offered it because he didn't want infection spreading under his roof. Maybe because living alone meant learning how to patch up your own wounds. Outside, the day brightened the wind, pushing through the grass and rattling the loose boards on the lean-to. Inside June stood still the wool shirt hanging off her shoulders, the smell of pine clinging to her skin, wondering for the first time if this cabin might hold something she hadn't known in a long time safety. She listened again for the sound of hooves, but the wind was the only thing moving. When Wyatt Reed finally returned late in the morning, June Avery McCall was sitting on the edge of the bed, arms folded across her chest, still wearing his wool shirt. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and brushed the dust from his coat. His eyes flicked once over her bare legs, the rolled sleeves, but didn't linger. He'd expected she'd find it. Without a word, he dropped his gloves on the table. "Fence is down on the north side," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I'll fix it tomorrow. Need to haul water for the horse now." June rose from the bed. "I can do something," she offered. He lifted a brow, not in mockery, just curiosity. "Like what?" She nodded toward the bucket by the door. "Water. Wood. Whatever don't take hands as strong as yours." Wyatt studied her for a long beat, then gave a short nod. "Buckets are by the trough. Wood's stacked behind the lean-to. Don't go past the rise coyotes, keep to the brush. I don't need more trouble." She didn't ask what would happen if she did. She just grabbed the bucket and slipped outside. The cold earth bit into her bare feet, but not as sharply as the night before. She crossed to the trough, filled the bucket, and carried it back in slow, steady steps. Wyatt coiled rope near the barn, glancing at her only once. He didn't take the bucket from her or tell her to stop. She made 3 trips in silence, the sound of water sloshing marking her rhythm. Then she went behind the cabin where the cedar pile waited, gathering kindling and short logs until her arms trembled. No one barked orders. No one laughed. No one told her she was doing it wrong. She carried the wood inside, stacked it neatly beside the stove. Wyatt looked her way but said nothing. The silence wasn't cold. It was simply unfamiliar. June sat at the table to catch her breath. He finally broke the quiet with a question that had been waiting since dawn. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then said, "June." "June Avery McCall." He nodded once. "Wyatt Reed." She'd already guessed he wasn't a man with brothers still living or kin nearby, but she asked anyway. "You always live out here alone?" "Since the raid," he answered. Voice low, steady, as if the word itself carried enough weight to explain everything. She didn't know the details, but she recognized the tone. Death had carved space inside both of them. He didn't ask her story, and she didn't offer it. As the day stretched on, they moved around the same small space without tension. For the first time in months, she didn't brace for a hand on her shoulder or a voice in her ear. And for the first time in 5 years, Wyatt didn't step outside to eat alone. By late afternoon, sunlight slid low across the hills, throwing long shadows through the open window. Wyatt stacked the last of the wood by the stove and checked the latch on the door more from habit than need. June sat at the table, sleeves rolled past her elbows, the wool shirt hanging halfway down her thighs. She watched him the way someone studies a wild horse, still cautious, but less afraid of being kicked. Her voice broke the quiet. "That dealer, Buck Slater, he know your name? You think he'll come looking if you don't bring me back?" Wyatt shook his head once. "Men like him don't chase what's already paid for. To him, you're gone. To the rest, you never mattered enough to chase." It wasn't meant cruel, but truth seldom landed soft. June took it without flinching. Men hadn't come for her before, except to use her or trade her. Survival had never meant being wanted, only being worth something. The silence that followed wasn't bitter, just real. She rubbed her wrist absently. The salve had dulled the pain, but the marks were still there. Wyatt noticed, then walked to the trunk at the foot of the bed and lifted the lid. "There's a clean underdress in here," he said, "from before. It'll fit close enough. You don't need to wear that torn thing anymore." Her brow furrowed. "Belonged to someone?" He hesitated. "My mother, Nana Willow. She left it behind when she went to town years back." June didn't move. It wasn't the memory of the dress that stopped her. It was the thought of wearing something tied to his past, stepping into a space she didn't have a right to. He didn't press her. Wyatt sat back down by the stove, adding beans and salt pork to a pot, the smell of smoke and meat filling the room. June stayed quiet, watching him work, her fingers tightening around the hem of his shirt. She could tell when a man was holding something in, and Wyatt Reed was holding more than most. She had never lived with a man who didn't fill silence with noise, boasting threats, or drunken rambling. This kind of quiet made June Avery McCall more alert, like she was waiting for something to break. After a long pause, she finally asked the question that had been burning in the back of her mind. "Why live out here all alone? Town's got work. Other ranches got men." Wyatt Reed stirred the pot on the stove once before setting the spoon aside. "Had work once, Had people too. Then I didn't. He didn't turn as he said it, but the weight in his voice said plenty. Hardest thing he added is staying in a place that reminds you who ain't there anymore. June didn't press. She understood more from what he didn't say than from what he did. Grief built walls around people, same as shame or fear. They both knew that kind of loneliness. She stood and picked up the gray dress he'd left for her fingers brushing along the seam. You got somewhere I can wash up. And change. He nodded toward the far wall, where a thick canvas curtain hung across a small alcove. Basin's back there. I'll heat some water. He lifted the pot from the stove and poured steaming water into the basin behind the curtain, then stepped back without looking. When June slipped behind it, she listened closely. His boots shifted on the floor, but he stayed by the stove, facing away. She undressed slowly, the cold air biting her bruised skin. The first touch of warm water stung before it soothed. She wiped away the dirt and dried blood scrubbing gently around her ribs, where each bruise still told its story. When she finally lifted the clean dress and pulled it over her head, the fabric brushed her shoulders and fell soft against her legs. It was loose but whole, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel exposed. When she stepped out, Wyatt didn't look surprised. He only glanced up to be sure she was dressed, then turned back to the stove. Food's nearly ready. June draped the torn buckskin dress over a chair, staring at it for a moment, torn between wanting to burn it or keep it just in case she had to run again. Wyatt set 2 tin plates on the table, each with beans and salt pork. The food was plain but hot. She ate slowly, careful with her jaw, while he ate without a word. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It just was. When they finished, she wiped her plate clean with a piece of bread. He didn't thank her or expect thanks. He simply gathered the plates and set them in the basin, washing them in silence. June watched the way he moved, how he stacked the dishes neatly, how he banked the fire like a man who'd lived too long with no one but himself to depend on. Finally, she spoke again. What about lawmen? You buy a woman in town and ride off. Somebody might say you stole property. Wyatt didn't even pause. A sheriff in Redstone Hollow sees worse before breakfast. No law there's worth a damn. Nobody's riding after me or you. June nodded quietly, letting the truth sink in. If no one came for her, then her choices began and ended here. That thought settled over her like dust, half relief, half fear. Outside, the light softened to gold. Wyatt laid out his blanket by the stove again, moving with the tired ease of habit. June stood by the bed. You keep sleeping on the floor. Folks see that they'll start talking. Wondering why a woman's in your house. He looked up at her. Ain't nobody riding out this far to talk, he said. And I don't care what they'd think. She watched him stretch out by the fire, his arm resting beneath his head. After a moment, she climbed onto the bed and pulled the blanket over her legs. The silence that filled the cabin this time wasn't the kind that made her flinch. It was the kind that felt earned. In the dark, her voice came soft but steady. If I stay, it's because I choose, not because you bought me. Wyatt didn't open his eyes. That's how it is. Something small but real shifted between them, then something fragile, like trust taking its first breath. When morning came, the wind pressed against the shutters, and a pale sky crept through the small window. June woke first again, but her pulse didn't race. She sat up slowly, the blanket still around her legs. The dress he'd given her was warm, not rough against her skin. Wyatt stirred, groaning softly, as he pushed himself up from the hard floor. He ran a hand across his jaw and glanced her way, not to check where she was, but to see if she looked steady. "I'll ride down to the creek after breakfast," he said. "Bring back water barrels." June noticed something she hadn't before: a second stool by the table, old but sturdy. He pulled it out and set bread-dried venison and a pot of coffee between them. And for the first time, they ate their morning meal together, like two people not strangers caught in each other's storms. She no longer rushed through her meals. The ache in June. Avery McCall's jaw had eased, since she'd washed, and the warmth of the coffee settled deep in her chest. She didn't wait for Wyatt Reed to start talking. He rarely did. Instead, she asked the question anyone listening would have wondered by now. "You got neighbors? Anybody close enough to see smoke or tracks?" He answered without a second thought. "Widow lives 9 miles south. Doña Hattie Crow. Got 2 grown sons, Frank and Amos. They keep to their land, don't want visitors." He stirred his coffee once, then added 2 more ranches west. "I don't cross their fences. They don't cross mine." June let that settle in. Distance meant safety from town men from whispers, but it also meant running was nearly impossible. No food, no boots, no sense of direction. She didn't ask if he planned to keep her here, or if saving her meant claiming her. She'd test that when she had to. After breakfast, Wyatt stepped outside to hitch the horse to an empty water sledge. June lingered in the doorway, studying the land spread wide and empty. Before her low scrub patches of yellowed grass, a jagged ridge 1/2 a mile east, and no road in sight. Only the narrow trail they'd ridden in on. He turned at the door. "I'll be gone a couple hours. You can stay inside or cut kindling. If anyone rides close, get in and bolt the latch." She frowned. "You think someone's coming?" "No," he said simply. "But folks who stop thinking ahead don't last long out here." She tilted her head. "You trust me in your house while you're gone?" He met her eyes evenly. "Wouldn't have left you in it last night if I didn't think you'd stay put." That answer carried more weight than he realized. June nodded once and stepped aside so he could pass. She watched him ride off toward the dip, where the creek cut through the land the horse's gait, steady, sure-footed. When he disappeared over the rise, she turned back inside. The cabin felt too still, so she moved. She cleaned the table, folded the extra blanket from the bed, then checked the latch. It wasn't obedience, it was habit, or maybe the first flicker of wanting order again. Outside, she gathered wood from behind the house. The wind bit cold through her skirt, so she kept his wool shirt on under the dress and tied a rope around her waist to hold it down. Behind the lean-to, she found tools hanging in neat order, saw a hatchet shovel all lined up by size. That told her plenty about him. Survival here wasn't just grit. It was discipline, preparation, control. By the time Wyatt returned with the water sledge, June had stacked fresh-cut wood by the door. He didn't comment, didn't praise, just noticed. He carried the barrels inside, steady under their weight. She followed, wiping the rims clean with a rag before he could say a word. They worked like two people who'd learned how to move through life without needing to speak for every motion. When he coiled the lead rope, Wyatt finally asked what had been sitting behind his silence. "You got people somewhere? Someone who might come looking besides the ones who traded you?" June's jaw tightened. "No family left. No one coming." He nodded like he'd already expected that. "Then you ain't bound to go back anywhere unless you choose to." Those words hung between them, simple but heavy. No one had ever phrased her life as something she could choose. She didn't show the relief, but it cracked something open inside her. Wyatt pulled salt pork and a sack of flour from the shelf. June filled the pot with water and found his one good knife. "I can cook," she said, "if you tell me what you got." He stepped aside, giving her the space without a word. While she worked, he sat by the stove mending a strap from the horse tack. The air between them shifted again, not soft, not yet, but no longer sharp. June stirred the stew and asked the question that had been waiting since the barn. "How'd you get money enough to pay that dealer without blinkin'? Sold 20 head last spring," he said, eyes on the leather strap. "Keep my coin where no one in Redstone Hollow knows it's there." She considered that. So, not a gambler, not a drunk, not a man buying trouble. "Just a man who's had enough," he said, tightening the strap, and did something about it when the time came. The stew simmered, filling the cabin with the scent of beans, salt, and smoke. She wiped the table clean, folded the cloth she'd used to wash, and glanced toward him. "That coin's gone now. You ever think maybe you should have saved it?" Wyatt looked straight at her. Not once. Her throat tightened at the steadiness in his voice. For the first time, she believed he didn't see her as a debt to be repaid. When the food was ready, she sat down without waiting for him to motion. He poured her water without asking. They didn't say grace didn't thank each other, but the absence of fear between them felt like grace enough. Afterward, Wyatt sat on the floor near the stove, stretching his shoulder, the one that looked like it still ached from some old wound. June watched him quiet the light from the fire, throwing his face half in shadow. For the first time since he'd bought her freedom, she wasn't watching for what he might take next. She was trying to understand what he'd already given. She finally asked what no one had dared to voice before. "Those raiders. Your brothers. Did they die quick, or did you see it happen?" Wyatt Reed paused, mid-motion, the axe still in his hands. When he answered, his voice carried the same steady tone he used when talking about the weather. "I was gone hauling supplies from a fort out east. Came back to smoke and what was left of a ranch." He looked past her shoulder, his eyes fixed on some memory buried in the horizon. "Took me 2 days to find their rings in the ash." June Avery McCall didn't murmur an apology or try to soften the edges of what he said. Loss didn't need pity. It already carried its own weight. "Wasn't your fault you were gone?" she said quietly. He shook his head once. Still wasn't there. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It breathed between them, filled with fire, crackle, and the slow rhythm of shared understanding. Neither reached for comfort that hadn't been asked for. That night, Wyatt didn't snuff out the lantern right away. He left it burning a little longer on the table, its glow throwing a soft circle across the room. June noticed, but said nothing. Some things didn't need names. By morning, something subtle had shifted between them. June rose when Wyatt did not, because he ordered it, but because the cabin no longer felt like a cage. He banked the fire while she folded her blanket and tied her hair back with a strip torn from the old buckskin dress. She hadn't thrown that dress away. It stayed folded under the bed, a relic of what she'd survived, a reminder of where she refused to return. Outside, frost edged the water trough, and the horse's breath came in white plumes. Wyatt went to split wood behind the lean-to, and June followed without waiting to be asked. She gathered each piece he split and stacked them neatly along the cabin wall. This time, when she bent to lift the logs, she didn't keep glancing over her shoulder. He noticed, but kept silent. Anyone watching might have wondered what she planned in the long run, whether she'd bolt once her strength returned. Wyatt wondered too, but he didn't ask. Trust wasn't something you spoke, it either held or it didn't. While stacking the last of the wood, June asked, "You got enough put aside for winter, or you still short?" "Short," he said, driving the axe down again. "Storms come early some years. I'll cut more from the ridge soon. I can haul smaller pieces," she said. "Don't have to swing an axe to carry." He gave a small nod. "Fine." Back inside, June checked the water barrel and poured a little into the basin. The cloth he'd given her was still damp from the day before. She wrung it out and hung it near the stove to dry. For the first time, chores didn't feel like borrowed time. They felt like living. As she swept near the door with a bundle of tied branches, another question crept up, the kind that lingered in a listener's mind. Had she ever tried to escape before? The answer lived quietly behind her eyes. The last time she ran, 2 men dragged her by the hair and tied her hands to a wagon wheel until her arms gave out. She carried that memory in the way she scanned doors, windows, knives. If she stayed here, it would be because she chose to, not because she'd grown too tired to run. By midday, Wyatt returned from checking the trough and the ropes on the lean-to. He wiped the sweat and dust from his brow and finally asked what he'd been holding back since the barn. "You thinking about leaving once you're steady on your feet?" June didn't flinch. She wiped her hands on the hem of the old buckskin she'd been using as a rag. "Thought on it," she said honestly, "but there's nowhere to go that don't lead back to men like the ones before. If I walk out that door someday, it won't be to run blind." Wyatt studied her a moment, then nodded. "Then you stay as long as you decide." She caught the weight of that phrasing, not as long as he allowed, but as long as she decided. She tilted her head slightly. "You plannin' on me working like someone who lives here, or sittin' quiet, waitin' to be sent off, you do what you're able," he said simply. "Same as me." And that was that. Later, while Wyatt repaired a broken hinge on the shed door, June raised another question the kind folks in town might whisper if they ever knew. "You don't worry people'll talk woman living out here with you folks twist that quick?" Wyatt didn't look up from his work. "I don't go to town but twice a season. Men in Redstone Hollow got their own dirt to choke on. They won't ride 8 miles to judge mine." She considered that, then asked what really mattered. "If someone does come looking to buy, trade, or take what then?" He set the hammer down and looked at her straight. "They won't take you. Not while you're under my roof." Her gaze hardened just a little. "And if I weren't under your roof," he held her stare, calm, steady, "then it's your say what happens next." That was the first time she heard the line drawn plain clear as daylight. She wasn't his property, not even in theory. And for a woman who'd been bought, sold, and traded like a coin, that single truth was worth more than all the gold in the territory. It didn't make June Avery McCall trust him outright, but it cut through the fog of guessing. By late afternoon, the light had turned amber across the ridge. She washed the tin plates, wrung out the cloth, and hung it by the stove to dry. Wyatt Reed had caught a rabbit earlier that day. He skinned it clean, tossed it in a pot with onions and a pinch of salt, then set it to simmer over the fire. They didn't talk while it cooked, but the silence between them wasn't the heavy kind anymore. When the stew was done, they ate quietly. Then, for the first time without being asked, June spoke. "I used to sew before I got taken. I can mend shirts if you've got thread." Wyatt tilted his head toward a small wooden box on the shelf. "Needle and cord in there. Shirt in the trunk's got a tear by the shoulder." She found it the fabric worn thin, but still worth saving. Sitting by the table, she worked the needle with steady hands, while Wyatt sat near the stove cleaning the dust from the brim of his hat with a damp cloth. The lamplight flickered slow and even, warming the small room in soft gold. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and laid it on the trunk. He didn't thank her, not out of coldness, but because he wasn't a man who wasted words. She didn't need them anyway. As the night settled in, he finally broke the quiet. "You still get nightmares?" From before. She didn't look up. "Sometimes." "Yeah," he said. "Me too. That was all. It was enough." June lay on the bed while Wyatt spread his blanket on the floor near the stove. The fire hissed once, then quieted. Wind scraped along the cabin's seams. She stared at the ceiling, remembering men who used to slam doors, drag her by the wrist, whisper things that made her stomach twist. Now she listened not for danger, but for the ordinary sounds of a place where someone meant what they said. For the first time since that barn, she fell asleep without her hand curled into a fist. By dawn, the wind carried a softer edge, warmer, scented with sage from the ridge. June woke before Wyatt again, but this time she didn't lie still, waiting for his moves. She sat at the table, needle in hand, patching another tear in one of his work shirts. When Wyatt stirred, he looked toward her, half surprise, half quiet recognition that the room no longer held just him. He poured water into the basin and splashed his face. She asked what most folks would have wondered by now. "You plan on heading back to town soon for supplies or news?" He dried his face with a rag. "Not for a month or more. Got enough flour and salt to last. No point in giving anyone in Redstone Hollow reason to think there's something worth coming for." June caught his meaning. If word got around she was still alive, someone might take interest. "And if that dealer talks?" Wyatt shook his head. "Bucks later. He won't. Barnful of men saw him sell you off. They'd laugh him out of town if he claimed someone stole back what he already got paid for." She leaned back in the chair, letting that sink in. Men like Buck never risked pride to admit they'd been played. That was a different kind of safety, but safety nonetheless. After breakfast, Wyatt grabbed his axe and headed toward the cedar stand a quarter-mile out. June followed behind with a coil of rope ready to drag back smaller branches. They didn't say much on the walk. The silence had shifted again, no longer sharp, but steady, like the rhythm of two people learning how to breathe in the same space. When he stopped to rest, he handed her his canteen. She took a drink and passed it back without hesitation. Wyatt worked slow and sure, each swing clean, deliberate. June bundled the cut branches and dragged them through the dust, the rope biting at her palms. By the time they neared the cabin again, she finally asked what others might have been wondering. "If someone rides up here asking who I am to you, what do you tell them?" He shifted the axe across his shoulder, his voice calm. "Tell them you live here." She studied his face. "Not bought. Not hired." "No," he said simply. "You're not for trade." The sun was sinking low behind the ridge by the time they got back. Wyatt stacked the cedar neatly by the door while June gathered loose bark for kindling. Before stepping inside, she looked at him squarely. "If I stay, I work. I'm not sitting around waiting on charity." He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "Then you work. You don't answer to me. Just don't leave gates open or burn the stew." That plain, simple answer settled something in her chest she hadn't known needed settling. Inside, she cooked while he repaired a hinge on the trunk. The scent of beans and smoke filled the cabin. When the food was ready, she didn't wait for him to sit first. And when he finally did, neither said a word. But for the first time, the silence between them felt like peace, not distance. They were past all that now. Halfway through the meal, Wyatt Reed broke the quiet with a question that had probably sat in his mind for days. "You ever have anyone before all that happened? Someone who might have come for you if they knew June?" Avery McCall shook her head, her voice steady but low. "I worked at a freight stable outside Abilene, 2 years back. Men were playing cards one night. One of them said I owed him for a bottle I never touched. By sundown, they'd passed me off over a bet." She swallowed her jaw tight. No one came after. Wyatt didn't look away. He didn't say sorry or offer hollow pity. He just nodded the way a man does when he understands more than he wants to. "Won't happen here," he said. June met his eyes. It already hasn't. After supper, Wyatt rolled up his blanket from the floor and placed it on the trunk instead of near the stove. She caught it immediately. "You moving off the floor?" she asked. "Or just tired of splinters?" He gave a faint half smile. "I'll sleep where it don't draft." He paused, then added evenly, "The bed's big enough for 2 not to crowd." Her eyes narrowed. "You askin' or tellin' askin'?" he replied. No strain, no heat, just a quiet truth laid down like kindling. She didn't answer right away. For a long moment, she stood by the table, the lamplight flickering across her face. A few weeks ago, words like his would have made her blood run cold. But this man, he'd never taken what wasn't freely given. He hadn't touched her in the night when no one would have stopped him. He hadn't demanded gratitude for pulling her out of that barn. So she stepped closer to the bed, slow, deliberate, and sat down on the far edge. "You try anything I don't want," she warned. "I'll break your nose while you sleep." He nodded once, calm as ever. Fair. That night they lay on opposite sides of the same mattress, each aware of the other's breathing, neither reaching across the space between. The fire in the stove burned low, filling the cabin with a soft, living hush. June stayed awake for a long time, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar quiet of safety. She listened not for boots outside or hands grabbing at her, but for the steady rhythm of Wyatt's breath. When she finally drifted off, sleep came without a fight. By morning, his arm had shifted close to hers, but not touching. She noticed and didn't move away. The questions that had haunted her since the barn, what he wanted, whether he'd trade her, how long before she'd have to run again, had gone still like dust settling after a storm. Not because she'd forgotten what men had done before, but because nothing in him carried the same shadow. When sunlight finally reached the cabin floorboards, it caught the small space between them, narrow but honest. Something unspoken had settled there in the quiet, chosen not forced. And whatever came next, it wouldn't be her running or him letting her go.